The Mindful Medic podcast is proudly sponsored by the Medical Benevolent Association of New South Wales, ACT. The MBA is an independent charity that has been supporting doctors in New South Wales and the ACT since 1896. They provide specialised counselling, information, referral and financial assistance to doctors and their families during times of adversity or hardship. Their aim is to provide non-judgmental support so that the doctor or family member recovers their well-being and independence and, wherever possible, returns to their vocation. Their services are free, specialised and no referral is necessary. All contact is kept strictly confidential and they are independent of any regulatory body. Hi everyone and a warm welcome back to the podcast. Hello if you're joining us for the first time. My name is Cheryl Martin. I am your host and you're listening to the Mindful Medic podcast. We're on season 3 and this is episode 2. Thanks to everyone who listened to episode 1 with Dr. Todd Fraser and took some time to give some feedback. We did talk about feedback in that episode. And I left with a lot to think about, a lot to work with. I'm using the Osler platform. And if you went to check it out after that conversation, I know that he would appreciate the feedback in terms of what you found useful, what you might like to see in the platform moving forward. And exactly the same applies to the podcast. I did mention that I have some ideas for some big themes I want to visit through season 3. And one of those will be lessons in leadership. And we're going to visit leadership from a number of diverse perspectives and, clinical and non-clinical. And we are going to revisit, themes from previous episodes as well. I mean, I really like that through these conversations, I seem to refer back to other conversations, other guests, other episodes, and I love the way they weave together. It's growing, it's developing, a bit like our community of listeners. One of those threads and themes that regular listeners will be familiar with is my particular interest in the art, science and application of performance science and psychology. And we get to talk about that again today. Today's guest is a leader, a clinician and a coach. So I think this conversation is, wonderful from, my perspective for a number of reasons. And just, as I'm sitting here, I have a book open in front of me from one of my favourite coaches that I mentioned in the podcast. Steve Magnus talks about the value of a coach. Steve's a running coach. And he talks about, for already high performers, a coach is to allow you to see clearly so that you can start from a place where sustainable progress and consistency is possible. And I think I talk a lot about longevity of practice, and I think that definitely feeds into that. So there's a lot of pearls in today's conversation. It is a longer episode. It probably could have been longer again. So I reckon we just get right into it. Enjoy.
I definitely remember my first job in the Clinical Excellence Commission with the remit of we need a quality and safety program, go. I honestly can still remember standing in this room with someone who had done speech pathology training and was a few years younger than me and had some project experience and already worked in the organisation, who was fantastic. Her name happened to be Sarah as well, and they ended up calling us the two Sarahs, of course. And we stood in this room back in the day when you had offices and a whiteboard. And I remember looking at the whiteboard and saying to her, okay, where do we start? And it was literally a blank canvas. And I remember saying to her, I don't really know how we're going to do this, but let me just think. If I was in the hospital and I had a problem and I didn't know how to solve it, what would I do? Okay, I would start with getting as much information as I could. And I can still picture on the whiteboard on the left-hand side was, now I would use words like environmental mapping and trying to work out the current state and that sort of thing. Next thing I would do, I would ask for help. So I would go and talk to experts and ask them what they think and find out what's already gone before and is there any best practice in this area. So then we had another column with all the people that we could talk to and find out what had happened, which I would probably now call stakeholder engagement and consumer and planning. And then it was like, well, what are we actually going to do? It's like, well, oh my goodness, this is a very big elephant. How are we going to eat it? What's the smallest thing that we can do first? And so we were like, all right, let's just make sure we've spoken to these people and done a quick research in this area by this time. So we started writing goals, and then there were long-term goals, and then we went and got help and feedback on that. And, what do you think we're doing right and wrong? And the really, really great thing was worked in an environment that was supportive and willing to let us have a go, willing to let us fail and learn, but also standing ready to support us and, I guess, raise us up when it went well. And it went well, and it was a fantastic experience.
You've just been listening to today's wonderful guest, who I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast, Dr. Sarah Dalton. Sarah is the Director of Clinical Engagement at eHealth New South Wales. She's a Paediatric Emergency Physician at the Children's Hospital at Westmead. And she's a previous President of the Paediatric and Child Health Division and Board Member of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians. She has worked in a number of different clinical and managerial roles across New South Wales over the past 25 years, from regional centres to specialist tertiary units, from community care to acute care retrieval services. So she brings a wealth of both clinical and leadership experience to the table. Indeed, she has a long-standing interest in leadership development, and she's previously completed a Fulbright Scholarship in clinical leadership. Her prior systems leadership roles include at the New South Wales Agency for Clinical Innovation and Clinical Excellence Commission. And she's a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and a member of a national not-for-profit board. In addition to these hats, she is also an executive coach. Sarah deeply believes in coaching as a critical opportunity for reflection, enabling individuals to address important challenges and unlock their own solutions. She completed the INSEAD coaching certificate in 2019, and she now offers professional coaching to healthcare executives and clinical leaders through Capstan Partners in Sydney. In these uncertain times, Sarah believes in the power of coaching to facilitate learning and reset directions to navigate the path ahead. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I honestly felt that I could have spoken with Sarah all day, could very easily have a whole podcast coaching conversations with Dr. Dalton. Perhaps, one to earmark for the future, watch this space. Throughout the course of this conversation, we will explore Sarah's creative career in medicine and her why as clinician and leader in the number of hats that she wears. But I really challenge you not to find something of value in what she has to say. And, I make no apologies for this being a longer episode. I think every second is worth it. Enjoy. Good morning, Sarah. Full disclosure, this is take 2. It was all going far too well this morning when everything worked first time. And then, a few minutes into the conversation when you were in full flow, my internet failed. I am so sorry. And thank you for being so gracious. So before we were rudely interrupted and you were in full flow, we were talking about, what I think is a very impressive and I think fascinating creative career in medicine that you have, wearing a number of clinical and non-clinical hats as a paediatric emergency physician, a director, and also an executive coach. And, I've given the formal bio, but I'd really love to hear, and you could give listeners an overview of that career trajectory from your perspective and, how that transpired, any serendipitous forks in the road and, what led you to be developing both clinical and non-clinical roles as physician and leader.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. It's so much a pleasure to be here talking to you. And when people ask me about my career, the first thing I normally say is that it's a bit of happenstance and going through open doors and being lucky and being interested and curious and all those things. But it was very much a meander that turned out to be quite interesting rather than a definite plan that I deployed. But looking back, I can see the connection. So looking back, it turns out that this is probably where I was always meant to be. I just didn't necessarily realize how I was getting here. And I can see now that the sorts of things that I chose to do are all very much related to my underlying drivers. And what I now realize is why I do what I do.
Fabulous introduction. I've written down here, luck versus opportunity, curiosity, creativity, and I like this idea of meandering, but being open to possibility. I also like that you've mentioned that you were able to connect and join dots in retrospect. Now, before my internet failed, you also said that you wanted to start with why. And, I can see Simon Sinek nodding approvingly in the corner here. I'd love to know what those drivers are and what is your why. And as someone who is in a number of leadership roles, I am sure that you have thought about this in some detail now.
I've come to the point of realizing that everything that I choose to do is about elevating the clinical voice or clinical leadership and medical leadership. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and I'm not alone in that. But I think ultimately, we really just need to have systems that are improved in healthcare by clinicians being involved and helping everybody understand about what's going to work. It doesn't mean that clinicians have all the answers. It's really about partnership and working together. But we have to have clinical leaders in places where decisions are being made and things are being designed and improved and innovated. And now I work in digital health and I can see that that's just so important. And in fact, I think where I work, they would acknowledge that as a digital health agency in New South Wales called eHealth, it's been a long time coming to have clinicians in the room when they're doing the design phase, and that technology in general for many years has been given to people to use rather than designed with people to use. But ultimately, having people who use the system in there doing the design can make a huge difference. And that's what I've observed in my eHealth job, which has been fantastic. And that's a reflection of all the other jobs that I've taken, which has been about finding ways to bring clinicians and system leaders together to improve the system.
Fantastic. And, it's that trajectory that I really wanted to explore in the first part of this conversation that's led you to become this critical voice in the C-suite, as they say, and this to be a central part of your work as a clinical leader. Because I think that, most of us see and appreciate there is a disconnect there in terms of perspective, maybe the language, and, don't necessarily feel that we maybe have the skills, the opportunity to lead and be the change we want to see and to make things happen. And so I really want to tap into your experience there, the challenges, the opportunities, and then the advice you would give to people listening who are aiming and trying to do similar. Because you are someone who is working on the shop floor. So they give the analogy, the leadership analogy of being both on the dance floor and up in the balcony, and how you navigate those roles. So I would like to start, I've said a big theme for this season of the podcast will be lessons in leadership. And I'd like to start with your leadership journey. And we might, go right back, what is leadership to you? And what has it meant to you through your career? And that might have changed. And what skills have you sought to cultivate for yourself to actually help you in your current roles?
There's so many things going through my mind as you're talking, Cheryl. Like, what is the definition of leadership? And how has the definition of leadership changed over the years? And are we actually talking about the same thing with a different view? And then how do you learn to do whatever it is according to the definition? And all of those things are very really interesting and probably not talked about enough, I think, in our medical training. What I was thinking as you were talking is that there's a difference, I think, between leadership and management. We could have a whole podcast on that. And then in how do you actually make leadership happen? What are the definitions of leadership? I think that's an interesting question. To me, leadership is fundamentally about change and working with people for change. So that can mean improvement, That can mean culture change, that can mean changing systems, that can mean changing people. But ultimately, I don't think that you can lead people without understanding people. And I think that a lot of my leadership development and journey has been about learning how people work and how people think. And because we need to be able to change systems, nothing really changes until people change.
I'm smiling as you're speaking here because, of course, I've now got Drucker quotes coming in thought bubbles in my brain. Thanks, Dad. So management is doing things right and leadership is doing the right things. And then, when you're talking about people, it's again, it's culture over strategy. So I really like that. I know that you've done a few specific things through your career in terms of leadership development training. And there was a recent discussion on a medical forum about this. And people were asking for some advice about, courses or further training that they should maybe think about undertaking in terms of, elevating their own leadership roles, maybe giving them opportunities for other jobs. And I'd love to know your perspective on this because I know you have done a few specific trainings as a graduate of the AICD. You've had a Fulbright scholarship in leadership. So, how useful are these things and what would you recommend to somebody who was looking to further develop their own knowledge, expertise?
Like so many of these things, I don't think there's one right answer. I think it depends who you are, what you like, and what you want to use it for, and probably how much time you want to put into it and how much money you have to spend on it. And one of the big debates that often comes up for people who really want to embark in leadership roles is, should I do an MBA? And I mean, that in itself is a huge question at one end of the spectrum. But I think for everybody, it's a mix, like everything. It's a mix of formal learning and also some structured learning. There's no real pathway to a medical leadership. Obviously we have the College of Medical Administrators, and I think there's a lot of leadership and management that people learn through that training program. My journey started because I signed up for a Masters of Quality Improvement. This was in 2004 when nobody really knew what quality improvement was. And I did that because I was in a place where they really believed in improvement and they knew about quality improvement as such. And in fact, my very first college project was quality improvement in the waiting room or something like that. And it was a very high level conversation because we didn't even really think about consumer experiences or anything like that. I ended up, the title of the paper was Consumer Experiences of Waiting in Emergency. And this was in 2005 or something like this. So it was a bit of a weird thing to do, if I'm totally honest. But it just appealed to me and my interest in change and improvement, I think. Anyway, I did this Masters of Quality Improvement, which was offered by Newcastle University, and they had so much trouble getting people to sign up for it that they had to shut it down because there wasn't enough interest. That's how long ago it was. But they turned it into a Masters of Health Management. So I completed the Masters by doing extra subjects and things that I wouldn't have probably done in a Quality Improvement Masters. I did finance, I did organisational development, I did people management and HR. So I learned a lot through that. In actual fact, when I looked back, that was in my final years of training and probably first year of being a consultant. And it was too soon for me to be able to apply that knowledge, probably. But having it in my brain and then being able to apply it as I continued in my roles gave me that retrospective view of, oh, now I've learned that, I can apply it. And so one of the things I learned in my master's was the Hertzberg two-factor theory of hygiene for work involvement, which is this enormously sentinel piece that I think was written in the 60s, but it still keeps coming up today. And my very first paper I ever wrote was called Motivating Medicine, Why Money is Not Enough. And I was fascinated by why people do the things they do and why doctors do what they do and how can we help doctors get better. So it opened a whole new way of thinking for me, and it meant that I met people who were like-minded and developed mentors and found myself in conversations that I probably wouldn't have been in if I hadn't have done that. It's the door that opened that I went through that led somewhere and I didn't know where it was, but it was really interesting. And then that put me in positions where I actually got the hands-on experience. And some of that was luck and happenstance, which I'm happy to speak to because it literally was a phone call in the middle of the night saying, hey, would you consider doing this? And I went, okay. And then that was the next step.
Yeah, wonderful. So let's go there. But just one thing, just as I'm listening to you in awe, I'm thinking, at that pointy end of your training, I actually couldn't fathom myself being able to, be able to undertake something like that, in addition to just getting through my exam and through my clinical work. I think the kind of brain, space, time, energy, motivation would not have been there.
Without sounding really old, it was a long time ago, right? So things were a bit different in the training programs then. I'm
Can I
RACP.
just say, Sarah, I'm only a couple of years younger than you.
True, but I went straight through med school when I was quite young through a 5-year degree. So I turned up for my first shift as a doctor when I think I was 22. So my journey has started a long time ago, and my training did as well. And the main thing probably that got me into doing this quality improvement work was that I had to do a college project. And because this quality improvement idea was a fairly new thing and in actual fact probably an easier thing than doing research, and it appealed to me because I'm such a practical, tangible person, I just want to get stuff done. I didn't really want to spend a long time trawling through data sheets and finding out if there was statistical significance. It just seemed like applied knowledge and it could actually make a difference. And I think that's what appealed to me about quality improvement. And so because I had to do my project, I thought, well, I may as well. I actually signed up for this master's that if you did 1 year, it was a certificate, 2 years was a diploma, and 3 years was a master's. So I signed up for a year and I thought that will help me get my project done. And then it became 2 years and then 3 years. And then I finished my projects. And then I ended up in a department that believed in quality improvement projects. And then I started doing quality improvement projects. It was actually through one of those quality improvement projects where we were rewriting a burns guideline that I was doing a statewide guideline. So for the first time involved in statewide system change. And I was working with a nurse practitioner, and, we've all got these amazing angel nurses in our lives who have been our, fairy godmothers. And Glenda literally was my favourite senior nurse who worked with me on this burns guideline. And she was strong enough to help me work at this system level to write a statewide guideline. And as was always the case, it didn't go to plan, and a lot of it was not the fault of us or the clinicians we were working with. It was the bureaucracy, in inverted commas. And so she wrote a bolshy letter into the New South Wales Health Department saying, this isn't good enough. We sent you this 12 months ago. We still haven't finalised it. We really need some support. We've got to get this guideline out there. People are asking for it. And she said, you have to sign this with me. And I said, okay. And I signed it with her. And I thought, oh, this is important. I was pretty annoyed as well because we'd spent a long time writing this consensus guideline. I didn't hear anything for ages. And then eventually the guideline went through. But shortly after that, I got a call from the Clinical Excellence Commission, which was at this point the organisation in New South Wales Health that was writing some of these guidelines, saying, oh, we need to set up a paediatric quality program, and there's not many people in paediatrics who understand quality improvement. And you wrote me this letter, and I figure you probably do. So do you want a job? That's the happenstance.
Yeah, this is gold. I'm curious because I don't think any leadership conversation is complete without a discussion of imposter syndrome. What went through your head when you got that call? And I'm thinking probably more about myself, but did you question your ability to potentially do this role?
Oh, 100%. I honestly thought they had the wrong person. I was like, hang on, do you know? And it's kind of like, you don't really want me, do you? I think the thing that that meant that I said yes was literally because I knew that there really weren't very many other people around at that time. Yeah. If there were lots of other people doing the same thing, I probably never would have said yes because I would have felt there could have been no way that I could be as good as them. But because I knew there weren't many other people with those skills, and I had the support of my boss and my team, and it was a new program working with people who were already quite established, and they, the person who called me acknowledged that and said, we'd support you. And this is important part of the story, because when I started working in the organisation, they set up executive coaching for the new leaders who came on board. That's when I had my first coaching experience, and that's what converted me to coaching.
Right, wonderful. I'm starting to see how the dots are joining up now. I imagine that at that point in a clinical leadership role, coaching was still, or having access to a coach was still quite novel.
Absolutely. It was really far advanced. And it was because the person who set us up, the deputy chief executive at the time, had coaching himself and had experienced the the important power of being able to reflect and grow in a safe place. And because there were a few other leaders, medical leaders coming into the organisation at the time, we had individual coaching and group coaching so that we could learn to work together as a group as part of a succession plan for the organisation. It was an extraordinary experience and opportunity.
I'd love to know if you have any standout memories or experiences of that early coaching process, and to what extent they have influenced your own journey to become an executive coach yourself today.
I definitely remember my first job in the Clinical Excellence Commission with the remit of kind of when need a quality and safety program go. I honestly can still remember standing in this room with someone who had done speech pathology training and was a few years younger than me and had some project experience and already worked in the organisation, who was fantastic. Her name happened to be Sarah as well, and they ended up calling us the two Sarahs, of course. And we stood in this room back in the day when you had offices and a whiteboard. And I remember looking at the whiteboard and saying to her, okay, where do we start? And it was literally a blank canvas. And I remember saying to her, I don't really know how we're going to do this, but let me just think. If I was in the hospital and I had a problem and I didn't know how to solve it, what would I do? Okay, I would start with getting as much information as I could. And I can still picture on the whiteboard on the left-hand side was, now I would use words like environmental mapping and trying to work out the current state and that sort of thing. Next thing I would do, I would ask for help. So I would go and talk to experts and ask them what they think and find out what's already gone before and is there any best practice in this area. So then we had another column with all the people that we could talk to and find out what had happened, which I would probably now call stakeholder engagement and consumer and planning. And then it was like, well, what are we actually going to do? It's like, well, oh my goodness, this is a very big elephant. How are we going to eat it? What's the smallest thing that we can do first? And so we were like, all right, let's just make sure we've spoken to these people and done a quick research in this area by this time. So we started writing goals, and then there were long-term goals, and then we went and got help and feedback on that. And, what do you think we're doing right and wrong? And the really, really great thing was worked in an environment that was supportive and willing to let us have a go, willing to let us fail and learn, but also standing ready to support us and, I guess, raise us up when it went well. And it went well, and it was a fantastic experience.
Oh, I love that really vivid image you've just depicted there of, the two Sarahs and the whiteboard going in and thinking, what do we need to do to make this happen? I love that you didn't initially have a language around, exactly the processes, but you thought, well, okay, let's go back to first principles. What would I do if this was a clinical encounter? How would I approach it? And I think we probably, underrate our own skills to be able to do that. And I think it also, you've got this valuable perspective as why this actually matters to people working and doing the job. I'm conscious that you've got years of subsequent experience that has probably tempered, some of what you've said there, because I did see all the SMART goals coming in. You did get very granular and specific, about the question you were asking, what you were trying to achieve, setting goals, making them attainable, relevant, time-based, seeking feedback and being in a safe space to potentially fail. I love all of that. I would love a Sarah on my team, both Sarahs. And I'm conscious that, I do, I'm as guilty as anyone of sitting around saying, oh, this needs to change, or complaining about X, Y, and Z. And I know that we can't change everything, but, sometimes we do set up processes where we trying to do that improvement and going through things. And, I'm aware that sometimes these things can be subject to a lot of faffing and fluffing and maybe not actually produce the relevant output. So I'd love to explore that, making things happen with you.
I was just thinking about one of my bosses said once that I should get a T-shirt that on the front says, "Can I ask a clarifying question?" and on the back said, "What's the action here?" Because I'm always that person. And to be honest with you, I have to be that person. And you meet so many emergency medicine clinicians in systems leadership. And I think there's an enormous number of reasons for that, from seeing the big picture through to being able to take actions and wanting to do something about it. But one of the things I have also learned is that you have to allow other people to think differently. So I'm a big system one thinker. I like to be able to listen to something, make a decision, take an action, and if it doesn't work, then I'll consider doing it differently another time. But there are system two thinkers who process by talking, and they like to take their time, and they like to be able to throw ideas around. And the way that they build ideas is to talk. And I find myself, in my endless day, you asked what my days look like when I'm not on the floor, they're endless meetings. And I find myself sometimes being very frustrated by what I perceive to be fluff, as you say. No one's taken an action here. No one said what we need to do. No one's really disagreeing with each other or agreeing with each other. They're all just offering their own opinion. And I do get very frustrated by that. But I have to remind myself that that's how other people think. And that you get better ideas if you have more people thinking. So I've learned, and I have to remind myself sometimes, to adjust my actions to work for others as well. So I will come in at the end and say, what's the action here? But I try to openly and curiously engage in the conversation in front of me without getting too frustrated about the action, for the sake of my learning and also coming to a better solution.
Lovely. I feel like I'm getting a bit of coaching here as well, because I think you've just given me a bit of a eureka moment and some insights into my own psyche at times. Thank you, Coach Sarah. I'd like to know what else, obviously you've had that coaching experience. You mentioned the masters. What else has been useful in terms of your training and development from a leadership perspective?
Let me go backwards to come forwards. One of the really interesting leadership courses I did was actually at Harvard, and it was Leadership for Physicians Executives with the Levinson Institute. And I'm not sure that it still runs, but it was the first leadership course that I went to that was a short course. And one of the problems with leadership courses is you can do everything from a 1 hour webinar to an MBA. And it was at Harvard, and I thought I was going there to get HBR, absolutely top of the range, management, corporate, come out being totally, a leader with a capital L. And I got there and found that it was run by psychiatrists. And I was a bit shocked, to be honest with you. But the thing that I walked away with was this amazing way of thinking about leadership as understanding humans and human change, and the need to be able to understand where individuals are coming from in order to work with them. And to change the system, you need to change people and their behaviour. And the reason I say that is one of the things I learned there is that leadership development is as much like childhood development in terms of the different phases that you go through as a leader. And you don't necessarily get taught that, and you don't necessarily read that anywhere, but you could certainly identify the people that you know in your life and in your experience at different stages of their leadership journey. So there's sometimes the reluctant leaders who are just starting out and they're not really sure how they're going to take a role. And then there are the people who sometimes get a bit overconfident because they think that they've seen it all and done it all, but in actual fact, everybody else sees them being a bit of a leader. And then there's the leaders who kind of just sit back because they've been there and done that and they're not quite as passionate, but they'll let other people get along. And then there's the wise elders who will probably not say a lot, but then come in with something gold at the end. And everybody has a leadership journey, but there is actually academic work behind leadership development and adult development journey in leadership. But one of the things, which is the reason I'm saying this to answer your question, is that people who end up on leadership trajectories, you can normally look back and see that they have been on some kind of leadership trajectory all their lives. And many, many doctors are in this situation. So they're often people who have been representative at something. They're often people who have had either formal or informal leadership roles. They're either the people who speak up on behalf of their peers, or they've been the chair of the something committee, or go on to be the RMO lead, or people who put their hand up in representative roles. And if you look through these trajectories, you can predict that people who have had leadership roles will continue to have leadership roles. And for me, when I look back, honestly, and probably like everybody listening to this, I've had leadership roles since I was at primary school. Not big, big scary ones, but just like, I was on the Student Representative Council. And then when I was in high school, I was in some kind of representative council. And then I was at university, I was the president of the Student Medical Society. And then I was the AMSA representative. And then I went to be the JMO representative. And, I'm not special. There's so many people in that situation. So I don't know when you ever wake up one day and say, I think I'm a leader, because in fact, many of us probably never do that. But if you think about what is the definition of a leader and what are the markers of a leader, I'm sure everybody could look back and see that they've had those markers in their lives.
And, I think certainly as clinicians, we are called, as soon as we qualify, to lead a small team, a department, from very early on. And I think I mentioned earlier, I think before we got cut off, that I think that it's important that I don't think we get any formal training in how to do that necessarily. We might have somebody motivated as supervisor or consultant in our department who gets us to think a bit about how we lead, particularly in resuscitation for emergency physicians. I certainly feel that I probably didn't have much insight or perspective of that through my clinical training, and then came out to part 3 and had other roles where I was expected to do things. And I'm very early on that journey, and I think I've had to go back and kind of rethink my learning. I'm kind of conscious that I think this should be incorporated into our training, but I'm not sure what that should look like. Now, I know that you also have a coaching hat, and I'm sure you're going to have a quite vested opinion in how that might play out in terms of clinical training. But how, if we were thinking about introducing leadership programs into training for clinicians, what should that look like, or what could it look like? Should it be done? Is it important?
I mean, I think we have to talk about it, and we have to do it. And the reason I start with we have to talk about it is I think it happens to a large extent invisibly. And that's because a lot of what we learn as doctors is an apprenticeship model. And we do go and read textbooks and study and pass exams, which is usually, or at least traditionally, on medical expertise. So how do you make a diagnosis and offer a treatment? But increasingly, that's moving to be other areas, which I know people call soft skills and then debate and say, well, actually, they're the hardest skills. But I think every time you've been on a ward round, you've been observing leadership. Every time you've been in a meeting, you've been observing leadership. And we know that role modelling is one of the strongest ways of people learning and strongest ways of people changing behaviour. So we all learn leadership, but we've never done it explicitly. That's what I mean about it being invisible. And that's a little bit about culture as well. Like, you think about the different training schemes and the way that people, I've certainly observed, and you probably have too, morph into their mentors in the way that they talk and they behave and the way that they act. That's all leadership development, but we just don't call it that, and we don't do it intentionally. It just happens. So I think if we talked about it more and we were more intentional, and we were actually alongside the role modelling and the invisible part of the role modelling of the learning, we're actually being explicit and talking about what good leadership looks like and what good leadership behaviours are, then we would be doing more explicit teaching. And I do think that there has to be a level of supervision and feedback around leadership as well. I'm not sure if you can assess leadership, because I don't think it can be right or wrong. One of there's so many sayings about leadership, and I really just don't know where to start. But I recently heard a quote which is different to what we normally hear, which I really like, which is that leadership is about disappointing people at just the rate to which they can absorb. But I love the quote, because it kind of is saying you're not going to get change unless you cause a little bit of discomfort. But if you cause too much discomfort, you will lose people. So you've got to take them along with you. but you've also got to get them to change. So ultimately, for me, leadership is about helping people move to a different place and overcoming a bit of discomfort, because there will be some discomfort.
There's different styles of leadership. What is your style? Do you have a style? Do you have a couple of styles? Do you change your style depending on what environment you're navigating?
You definitely need to change your style. And if people haven't read about situational leadership, it's really worth reading. And, like doesn't have to be a whole book. There can be just a couple of different paragraphs that you read. Basically, it says you have to change your style to your situation. And I think emergency doctors do that all the time. Because if you're in a resus, it is totally different to if you're sitting down with a paediatric patient and their parent trying to talk about something that you'd like them to think about doing, or a negotiation or something different. So style is completely different. And I think all our clinical environments are replicated into our leadership environments. So the fact that you need to have a different style for different clinical environments, you can use those same approaches in your different leadership environments. I think that we all have a go-to place with our style of leadership. And it was really interesting. I recently did some interviews because I needed to bring someone onto my team. And at the end, I said, do you have any questions? And one of the candidates said, it's really important to me who I work with. Can you tell me what your leadership style is like? And I kind of went, oh my God. And then I thought, actually, that's an excellent question. Number one, because you really do want to pick your leader. In reflection, the best jobs I've ever had have been because of having a great leader. But also, it is when you're working with a leader, it's about their style and it has to fit your style. But I have been asked by people also when they first come into my team, which I think is a good question, not quite so surprising as at the end of an interview. When we work together, how do you like to work, and what would you see as being your leadership style? And I always tell people that I'm a really distributive leader, participative leader, collective leader, whatever that means. Because my other favourite quote about leadership is to surround yourself with great people and get out of their way.
Fantastic.
Having said that, you've got to have good people and they've got to have the right direction, and you've got to make sure that everything's going to plan. But if you can do that and get out of their way, that's my number one goal in life. I'm currently working with a team who are fabulous, and I try to get out of their way, and it is amazing.
And those conversations that you've just described, are you having those more in your the New South Wales digital health space? Because it strikes me that these are conversations I'm not seeing happening in the clinical environment so much, but should these be questions that we are discussing in the clinical environment, I think?
It's actually a really good question that made me think about it as well, because I have definitely learned about this and talked about this more in the jobs where you sit down and talk to people in a meeting type environment or a one-on-one type environment, rather than being on the floor and super busy. But the distributive leadership style is one that you can actually apply with your trainees. And essentially it means the more senior someone is, the more you delegate to them. But what I'm finding now that I do with my trainees in an emergency department is when I meet them for the first time, as well as finding out, tell me a little bit about your experience so I have some sense of how senior they are, I will often say to them things like, if they're fairly junior, because I know that you haven't had a lot of paediatric experience, because obviously I work in a tertiary paediatric emergency department, what I think would be good today is if you come and tell me about what you've discovered, and because you're relatively new, I'll probably give you a fair amount of feedback about what I think, and probably a fair amount of direction about what I think needs to happen. But I really want you to understand what we're doing. So if you have any questions, please ask me. If it's someone more senior, and lots of amazing people I work with actually now have their FACEM fellowship but are doing a bit of extra paediatrics, so they're incredibly senior, I might find that out and say, oh, that's fantastic. I'm so pleased to know that you're here. The way I could see things working today is that you're clearly independent and autonomous, and you don't need me for very much at all. But of course, if you have any questions or you'd like to run something past me, come and ask. If you have any dilemmas, and you might find that I check in on you from time to time, but that's just because I'm on today and I really need to know what's happening. And at the end of the shift, if you want to debrief anything with me, or maybe think about what you might have learned today, if there's an opportunity to do that, let's try and do that too. So I'm not only framing with people my understanding of their seniority, but also our combined understanding of how we're going to work today. And it's really interesting because I found a lot of junior doctors have been sometimes like, oh, that's great, thank you. I'd really like to come and talk to you about every case. And I hope that more senior people also think, oh, that's good to know that I can be autonomous and not have to report back. And it's not perfect. I'm not suggesting I get it right every time, but I think we don't actually externalize that enough.
Mm. Oh, I mean, I'm sitting here thinking I want to work with Dr. Dalton. I mean, fantastic. And I'm curious to know how much your leadership training, and we're going to go talk about your coaching journey, has influenced that. Is this something that's evolved over time for you? I mean, you may have been doing this as a newly qualified specialist and doing it since day dot, but I'm still interested to hear how it has evolved and how you've adapted it over time.
Everything improves with time, doesn't it? And as we all become more experienced and more reflective, we all learn and improve. What's been interesting for me thinking about my coaching style, because I think I do have an underlying coaching style, and the best way to describe that, I think, is more asking, less telling. But what's interesting to me is that I know that when I'm talking to trainees about patients, for example, if you just want to put it in that clinical framework, once I've heard a story, and depending on how senior the trainee is, whether they've offered what they think their management plan should be, I'll often say something like, what do you think are the options for treatment and what would you like to do next? And I've found that that's an interesting question, because some people embrace that and they're really happy to say that, and I feel really comfortable with what they say. And some people look at me like, what do you mean? What are my options and what do I want to do next? Aren't you supposed to tell me what I do next? And I sometimes wonder whether people are going, God, she doesn't know what to do next. She wants me to make up my mind. So it's quite hard sometimes to have that ability and perhaps confidence in yourself to say to someone else, what do you want to do now, without thinking they think I don't know what I'm doing. And we have a number of fellows who come and work with us, and they always write lovely things afterwards, and some of them take the time to write individual comments, which is wonderful. And several years ago, one of the fellows wrote a thank you letter to the department, and thank you to the head of department for your amazing leadership and direction, and thank you to someone else for helping me learn how to do education. And then the one for me was like, thank you for teaching me how to think. But it was something like, I always knew that you would ask me what I wanted to do rather than telling me. But what's really interesting is my reaction to that was, oh my God, he didn't learn anything from me. And he thinks I don't know what I'm doing. So that was my moment of going, these are really important conversations, and framing them in a different way is important. And backing yourself is important, but it's hard. And maybe I haven't always got it right.
Lovely. I mean, I think this is a joy to listen to. I think there's some real gold in, particularly those last pearls and techniques that you have shared. And I think people listening, will be able to go away and take them back to the clinical floor tomorrow. I've certainly been given a bit more food for thought. And I think on that last part, you've also very nicely demonstrated the need to stay humble and to be, demonstrate that vulnerability in your leadership, your coaching, mentoring, teaching, because we are also always growing in those roles. And, I think this would be a nice segue into your coaching journey, because you have peppered through quite a nice number of techniques through that last 10 minutes of conversation. And you mentioned that, you initially had an interest in coaching as a coachee when that was offered to you in that first leadership executive role. I'd love to know how things have evolved from there, what led you to actually do a formal coaching qualification and now to be a professional coach yourself.
The first time I had coaching was part of a really executive development program in a New South Wales health leadership role. It wasn't in my clinical role. And I didn't really know what it was, but the way that it was set up started with a 360 assessment. And I think that helped me understand what coaching was, because it was pretty much do this assessment and then go and talk to this person about what it means to you. And so I was given the focus for the conversation by having the 360. And that made it easy then to go into a conversation with a coach and break it down, have a grief reaction, set some goals, work through what it meant, and then continue to go back and have a focus on the areas that I wanted to improve over time. A number of leadership courses I've done have offered coaching, sometimes only 1 or 2 sessions, which I think can be hard, because The purpose of coaching when it's at its best is really to give the person who's being coached an opportunity to set some goals, to go away and practice something, to come back and reflect on if it worked, and slowly build over time. It's a bit like going to the gym. You're learning new skills. You have to keep building and strengthening and making some things better and some things different. And it doesn't happen, in one session. But one session is probably better than nothing. The reason I think the 360 was important is not only do I think that's a really important thing to talk about in general to get that feedback, but it gave a focus to the coaching. One of the things that some people find hard to understand, not only about what is coaching, but what do I talk about in my coaching session? And there has to be a focus or a goal or a point at which there's something you really want to work on for it to be effective. So if you sign up for coaching and you're not actually sure what you want to talk about, your coach in the first session will work with you and usually identify something, because most of us have something going around in our head that we want to work on. But the more you know what you want to focus on, the more productive you'll find the sessions. A little bit like if you go to the gym and, the first thing they say is, what are your goals? Do you want to get fit? Do you want to get strong? Do you want to sleep better? Do you want to whatever? Because the way that you tailor the work that you're going to do will be more likely to achieve that goal if you can be clear about what it is.
Yep, nice. I like that you brought in the gym sport analogy. We have spoken about coaching on this podcast a couple of times now. We had Shari Johnson on at the beginning of last season, who's an executive coach of doctors. And then we had my colleagues, Doctors Charlotte Durand and Dr Alice McNamara, talking about their roles as both elite athletes and clinicians, and they've both had coaching in their athletic space, and and looking at the kind of pearls from there in terms of goal setting and deliberate practice and periodization, and there's lots of pearls that came out of that conversation. And and I do the science of coaching and performance does, I believe, translate, and I think we should be doing this. I think this should be endemic in what we do as clinicians. Particularly I'm thinking, towards the pointy end of a specialist training when you're trying to prepare for fellowship. I think there's a lot of work that can be done through that period, which is notoriously difficult. And then, as we continue and we're spat out into part 3 and develop as specialists, so I'd love to hear your perspective as both clinician and coach about where the benefits lie and how you'd like to see us. And I imagine that you might, and I'm probably speaking for you, embed this into the work that we do in training and in clinical practice.
I think coaching is imperative for anywhere where you want to focus and have deliberate improvement. And that should be all of our professional development. So coaching can be incredibly helpful, I genuinely think, at any point in your career. Having said that, the things that are most common that people bring to coaching are essentially things around very important goals like passing exams or doing interviews, because it provides a very focused goal. This is what I need to do. This is what I overcome to do it. And then anything really which I describe about being positions and transitions. So if you're in a leadership role or you're in a new role, having a leadership coaching program just is really a focus on your individual strengths and weaknesses. You may have a 360. You may already have enough self-insight or do a self-reflection assessment to have some idea about what you want to work on. And it's an ongoing process of thinking about the areas that you want to focus on and how you're going to work on them. I'm happy to tell you mine in a moment as an example of what that looks like. The other thing is transitions. So again, it's often people thinking about where they want their career to go. And for some people, it's about moving away from what the career trajectory is that they thought they were on and doing it differently. So sometimes it's about, I really didn't think this was going to happen, but I don't want to continue with my training. What else can I do? Or sometimes it's about, I would like to do something different in this specialty, but I'm not quite sure where. Or sometimes it's about taking a role in a different place or a different level of seniority or some level of change. So coaching can be particularly helpful in transitions because you really are actively learning. You're in that unconscious competence phase where you really feel like you're not quite sure if you're there yet, and you have an opportunity to talk to someone to help reflect and learn as you go.
So I have a couple of questions for you, and I apologise because I'm probably going to get a bit wordy here. I just want to offload a couple of the things that have been whirring around in my brain, particularly recently. So I really like this idea of using coaching for the transitions. I think I mentioned, I think periods where we potentially can get stuck. And again, I'll speak from personal experience and, I think perspectives of many colleagues that I've come in contact with over the past few decades. That I think preparing for a specialist and fellowship exam is a particularly challenging time, and also becoming a new specialist, interviews. I imagine also maybe choosing a career path earlier on in training, and then you've mentioned that changing might also come in there. I think that many of us, and again, maybe I speak just for myself, but appreciate the value of coaching and what it potentially could do for those particular periods, but are still, question and maybe a bit skeptical about the investment in terms of money, time, energy. And I know you've done a bit of work around this, so I wanted you to speak to that. But also my experience has been that, we often have to fall in a hole before we start to think, well, what I'm doing isn't working. I need some more support, and then look at what is available to us. And my experience with doctors is that we do that well past the point where it actually would have been helpful. I find it interesting. So through the Australasian College of Emergency Medicine, we have something called the AEP program, which actually has a number of services available. It's free to members, fellows and trainees. You can access coaching, you can access, leadership training, conflict management, there's finance advice. And there's psychological support and counselling. And I think, though, it still comes across that people think, oh, that's just counselling, which in itself could be potentially of value. But I think, I think it's very depressing to me that we still have this taboo around that. I've spoken about it too many times in this podcast now that I've lost count. But I sat very recently in meetings where, fellows all weren't really sure what this actually was and what it entailed. And we had a speak about needing to rebrand it. And, I find it interesting that I mentioned this through the year to our trainees. And then, still when push comes to shove, people don't actually know anything about it. So I think, that's interesting in terms of, getting engagement and buy-in. If this is marketed more as, coaching and performance enhancing, then you get us there and get us over the line. So sorry, I did say this was going to be a waffle. And I think just developing that, I see, and again, I've seen this in myself, I've seen it in many, many people now, that you maybe get to that point of preparing, for example, for a fellowship exam, and, very rarely when you've been competently running emergency departments overnight and everybody's been quite happy for you to do that. Is it knowledge and skills? Certainly I think in terms of coming to exam, technique is something we can definitely need to drill. But quite frequently you can start to fail a few things through that process and have setbacks, and, you're still doing your clinical work. And then, I think, and again, I will speak for myself that, my identity was very intimately linked to my being a clinician. And that when you do, when things don't go well in terms of, failing an exam or having some setbacks through a process, you start to question your value, not just as a clinician, but, as a human, and then start to kind of question, what you're actually doing in terms of your career trajectory. And I'm conscious, the past 2 years have made it even more challenging to prepare for a fellowship exam, but just made it more challenging generally for everyone. And probably more people are questioning. And, I know that you have done a bit of research work around this. I'd love you to speak to, but also I'd love your perspectives on, what I've just presented there and offloaded as a clinician and coach.
It's so heartbreaking to know how commonly that happens, and how much more frequently it's happening now than it ever has in terms of the situation we find ourselves in the COVID recovery. I think the story about how we support people through burnout is definitely one that coaching can support. And I think that coaching can offer all sorts of things to different people at different times. And, again, we talked about transitions as a place where coaching can help, and transitioning out of whatever we've been into whatever comes next is a big part of it. But the question about how much time do you need to spend is a really good one, because we know that time is almost our most precious resource. I think the answer is twofold. One is there's a standard approach, and the other one is pretty much anything is possible if you want to tailor it for what works for you. So most standard coaching programs will suggest 1 hour program, and you'd have a 1 hour session probably at least 3 times to see if that's going to work for you. And that would probably happen about 3 weeks apart. It gives you a chance to work on something in between, come back and say if it worked, and then finally after the 3rd session you might say that was actually great, or I learned this or that, but I'm going to do something differently next time. Because we know that people are different, it's important to have different ways of offering. Some people really enjoy coaching and find it so helpful, and I personally found it so helpful that I had probably sessions over 6 months almost every year. So I would have probably monthly sessions 4, 5, 6 times. And then I'd have about 6 months off, and then I'd come back and do it again. So some people are serial coaches, and then some people only have a short session, and it depends a little bit on what your goal is. One of the things that we researched recently with Black Dog Institute was an approach to coaching that actually came out of the Mayo Clinic, which was coaching for physicians, and they did it in half-hour sessions. And from a coaching perspective, traditional coaches say, really, half an hour? You can't achieve anything in half an hour. I think the reason it was offered in half an hour is exactly what you've just said. It's so much more accessible if you just need to find a space for half an hour. And we studied that at one of the tertiary hospitals in Sydney, which was a half-hour session over 6 sessions, and that was about every 2 or 3 weeks apart. And what was fantastic was that we had a really high sign-up rate and a really high completion rate, and all the people who finished it said they wanted more, literally, which was fantastic. But most importantly, the measures that we looked at, which was well-being, solution-focused thinking, and flourishing, all improved over that time, which was pretty amazing to me based on half-hour sessions. But I think the reason it worked is that people could do it, they could fit it in, they knew they had the session coming up, they could think about in between what they wanted to talk about, and it was frequent enough that it held them accountable and held the message in the front of their head for them to keep working on. And several people have continued to have half-hour sessions. I still coach someone who has half-hour sessions, who comes to the session and says, oh, I've been waiting for this all week. I've had this big challenge and I just needed a safe place to come and talk about it. I know what I want to talk about. And within half an hour, we've come to a point where they say, oh, that's great. I thought I didn't know what to do, but now I know what I want to do. So you can use coaching in different ways. It can be very front of mind. This is a problem I have to solve today, or it can be big picture. Like one of mine was managerial courage in inverted commas. I really needed to find my voice to speak up. And that's been something I've worked on for very many years. And that's probably why I kept going back month after month, because you can't fix that quickly. But the smaller conversations, like how am I going to work with that really difficult person in my department, that could potentially be a shorter series.
Yeah, lovely. I mean, I think that study is gold. It's achievable, as you've said, and people found it accessible and of value, and value was actually demonstrated. So given that, how would you actually like to see us progress and incorporate this into our clinical work and training?
I think receiving coaching one way or the other is something that all of us should have an opportunity to experience. It doesn't work for everybody. It's not going to be accessible or appealing to everybody. But if you could try it, if it works for you, it can be very effective. That can look like different things. One of the good things about signing up for coaching external to your organisation is it's completely independent, and you can say and do whatever you want, and the person you're talking to doesn't even know the people you're talking about. So it's probably at its most effective coaching when you're talking to someone who's quite removed from your workplace. But what it could look like for health organisations going forward is that the organisation itself has coaches who support internal clients. That's certainly what the corporate world is doing. When I did my coaching certification at INSEAD, which is a business school in Europe, there were people there from KPMG, from Deloitte, from PricewaterhouseCoopers, who were all setting up internal coaching programs. And they had come, the people who were there were all executives who'd had a lot of experience and were interested in coaching. They were learning coaching skills to go back and set up internal coaching programs. I think that's a really long way off in healthcare, but I think that's an option. Having said that, just learning some coaching skills as a leader or a supervisor, you can offer people coaching like conversations by learning some coaching skills, and they're not really that hard. So I think the other thing is I would like to see coaching skills being taught to doctors.
Yeah, and again, you've got me thinking about the other thing that I seem to keep revisiting in my brain at the moment. The fact that it does take so long for us to implement research and evidence into practice. I think that applies universally in organizations, but healthcare is far from any exception in that. And then you see, what happens through a crisis and a global pandemic, and how we can actually, innovate, pivot and make things happen, that much faster. And, again, we've spoken about this a few times. And yes, I think the other thing to say is that you've just mentioned a lot of other organizations there, with knowledge workers where this has been built in and they've been doing this for a number of years. And look, I think we're probably a bit behind in that progress. It's not that sometimes these things are accessible, but I think they've not really normalized in our space, because most hospitals do have an AEP program. As I've just said, the college has, confidential program. But, I sat in a room full of my colleagues and they had no idea that there was 6 domains to this and that coaching was one of them. And how you actually relay information and how you market it. I think the other thing I'd like to ask you, because you are both physician and coach, and, just to kind of explore the pros and cons of being both doctor and coach.
Traditionally, when you learn to coach, you're taught that it's better to be from a completely different background to the person that you're coaching, because then you can really genuinely just have curious inquiry, because you really don't know. And that will help the individual who's coming to you, because you might ask a question that nobody else in their industry would ask them, because everyone else in their industry has got that cognitive bias where they just accept it's normal. So traditionally, coaching is an offering where the coach is from a different background. So when I had my executive coaching, the person who coached me had done a lot of coaching of executives, but not a lot in healthcare. So I think that can be really helpful, because I remember she said to me, so where do you go for supervision when you have a problem and you're not quite sure what to do? Who do you talk to? And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, in a lot of industries and, in coaching, for example, if we have difficult challenges, we all have supervision groups, and we go to the supervision group and we raise this challenge and somebody will help us. What do doctors do? I was like, what do you mean, what do doctors do? Doctors don't need to do that. I mean, of course, doctors need to do that. But we're taught as doctors to internalize all this, to have the solution. If you don't have the solution, then you don't necessarily need to let on. Just say something mildly sensible and hope that people will believe in you and go and do it. Of course, I'm simplifying it, but coming from a different background is very helpful. Your question, though, about how can it help to be a doctor who coaches, I think is because the language is so different in medicine. And so I think as a doctor, talking to other doctors, and when they say, this is my part 3, I've got a advanced trainee that I don't know what to do with, and the LHD is really at me because of the KPIs and the 4-hour waiting time. I just obviously made up something that probably doesn't completely go together. I would say to you, oh my God, I know what you mean. That's terrible. Talk me through how you're approaching it. Someone who's never coached in healthcare might say, can you just break that down for me a bit? Which is okay in terms of course, it's absolutely fine to have someone who's not from a healthcare background, but then you're spending a bit of the time in the coaching session educating them. So there's definitely pros and cons. I think there's actually a lot to learn from having coaching outside doctors. And I always say when people come for coaching, I work with an organisation called Capstan Partners, and if they approach me about coaching, I always say to them, you might want to consider whether you'd like a doctor as a coach or not having a doctor as a coach, because there's definitely pros and cons both ways. I think the main thing is that you need to talk to someone who's done coaching in healthcare so that they understand a bit of the language.
Great. And, I'd like to develop that perspective that you bring as both clinician and coach, to the healthcare space. You've mentioned a few of the things that coaching can be useful for in terms of positions and transitions, but also made mention of the wellbeing conversation and, our epidemic of burnout that has only intensified and worsened through this past 2 years, and will continue to do so. And I know that you've done quite a bit of work in this area. Setting your coaching study with the Black Doc Institute has been instrumental in leading change and introducing the coaching conversation to the wellbeing space. But you also were part of a white paper, Beyond Burnout, that was published at the end of last year by the Health Roundtable and Beamtree Collaboration. And you're one of the thought leaders contributing to that. And I'm definitely going to link that in the show notes. I think it's an excellent paper. So I wanted to develop some of your work and talk a bit about some of the links that you actually sent me as some pre-reading. And the ABC framework, so autonomy, belonging and contribution, which is a framework for nurses and midwives' core work needs. So I'd love if you could explain a bit about that work.
The ABC framework from the King's Fund is so fantastic because obviously as doctors we really relate to ABC, but it just simplifies what is a very difficult concept in some ways. It's also a similar approach to the way that Dan Pink talks about autonomy, mastery and purpose. And that for me was been one of my most sentinel reads that I still refer to many years down the track. The reason I like it is because it talks about what do people need to feel motivated or engaged or not burnt out, which is obviously at the end of the spectrum where we all want to be and we all want our teams to be. I love to talk about burning bright. We keep talking about burning out, but we need to use positive language. So what does it take to help people burn bright? Some of this is your professional well-being and part of this is your personal and your health well-being. And it all contributes, obviously. The ABC that the King's Fund have put together speaks to it really well. It basically talks about autonomy, belonging and contribution. And all the things that we do as individuals and that our organisations can do for us to help us burn bright will one way or another fit into those headings. I think as doctors, we have in some ways a lot of autonomy and in some ways none. And it depends on where you're working in the system. And that can be the hardest thing to control. One of the things that coaching does is it helps you think about your spheres of influence and what you can control and helps you narrow in on something you can control so that you can have that sense of autonomy. In addition to that, it's important to think about belonging and contribution. And belonging is something everyone gets, right? We want to be part of community. We want to feel like we're contributing. We want to be part of something bigger. And there's so many different ways of doing that. But I do like also the concept of contribution, or Dan Pink would call it mastery, which is having that sense of purpose and being really good at what you do. And the big thing for burnout that keeps coming around again and again and again is the sense that everybody needs to work at the top of their game. We need to be able to go to work and do what we do best. And that means that we need to know what we do best, but we need to focus on what we do best. And I think that that's where coaching comes in because it helps you reflect, especially if you can think of something that you do best where you can have a sense of control and potentially be part of a group. And that's things like what you're doing, Cheryl. Like you've got a lot of autonomy over how this runs. You're bringing together a community of people who are like-minded, who are thinking about the same sorts of thing. You've got very clear purpose and contribution. And I've heard you talk yourself about being in your third series of podcasting and getting better every time. So you're mastering it. So this is a happy place when you can do all those things. And that's what coaching does ultimately, is helps you find your happy place.
I'm sitting here grinning now. Thanks, Coach Sarah. I love this podcast project because, it has allowed me to connect with people, amazing people like yourself, who share, the skills and their expertise. And then we can have these conversations and share ideas. And I love that we are building a community, and the people that this has brought into my life has been incredible. And, I really liked the Dan Pink link. I had seen it before. I listened and watched it again last night. And I will link it in the show notes. But I'd love if you could, maybe explain for people listening what that tells us about, our motivations and how that might apply in, for example, a clinical setting, as we work on this road to mastery.
I think really what he's saying is based on something called self-determination theory. So if anyone is really geeked out on this, like I can be, then you can go and read about it. But it pretty much says that when we're in control and we're doing our best work and we feel like we're making a difference, then that's when we are happiest, when we do our best work. And this is a place that people probably recognize when we talk about flow. When you get into something that you're so good at that you don't even notice the time going past. It's the concept of what job would you do for free? Because you just love it so much that you don't even notice that you're working. Now, clearly, there's work to be done. And I've always said to trainees, you've got to choose an area to specialise in where you can tolerate the bread and butter. Because there's going to be bread and butter in everything, and there's going to be the frustration end of every specialty. There's always the downside to every specialty. So you have to choose something that you're going to be able to tolerate the downsides. But more than that, you need to find something where you're really going to be in your happy place, in that zone of being able to do something that you really care about, that you love at, that you're good at, that you can get better at, and where you can have some level of control or influence, because then it's ultimately at the top of the hierarchy of needs, that self-actualization, when you're able to do your best work. And that's what I think I like about Dan Pink's work, is he basically says these are the things that motivate people. Doesn't matter how much you pay them. Doesn't necessarily matter how much authority or status or anything else they have. It's really about them being able to express themselves. And in his book, he talks about giving an experiment where they gave a whole bunch of artists the job of basically commissioning the best picture they could draw. And they gave half of them a financial incentive, like if you win the prize, you'll get money, and half of them just the incentive that if it was chosen, then they would get to go up on the, art gallery wall. And then they got independent art experts to come in and rank them. And of course, the people who were given the financial incentive did not do as well as the people who just had the opportunity to do whatever they wanted that they thought was beautiful. And they were the ones who actually, apparently, according to art experts, performed better. So I really love the concept that if you tap into what you love and what you're good at, and you help other people do that, they'll probably do better than if you're giving them a competitive task or a financial reward or some kind of status or hierarchy.
Yeah, I love the direction this conversation is going in, Sarah. Thank you. So you've brought in, the concepts of flow that we've spoken about a few times on the podcast, particularly with respect to peak performance, and that's a topic that I can geek out on the science and psychology of for many, many hours. We visited it in the podcast with Dr. Stephen Hearns, Dr. Dan Dworkis, and this idea of flow being seeking out these just manageable challenges, the sweet spot between skills and struggle with clear goals, immediate feedback, and you can see the value of coaching to assist with that. It also makes me think of my favourite book, which I think I've also mentioned, Peak Performance, by Steve Magnus and Brad Stulberg. So Steve is a running coach, former elite athlete, and Brad Stulberg, former McKinsey consultant, writer and executive coach. And they have a podcast that I listen to regularly now called The Growth Equation. And I knew that I was going to be having this conversation with you. And there's a couple of things I've been jotting down this week thinking, I wonder what Sarah would think of this. And I think, just as an aside, I would absolutely love to see a coaching conversations with Dr. Dalton podcast. So I might get you to park that idea for the future when maybe we both have more time. But I just wanted to float something past you that I have jotted down. There's quite a few things I've jotted down, so we'll maybe not get through all of these. But, just talking about that training for performance, and, Steve calls, quite frequently in this environment calls us pushers. And I think many people listening might identify with that kind of term. And he talks about the role of coaching, and he says that pushers, when faced with insecurity, can often double down and thinking the solution is to work harder, when it isn't necessarily to do that. It's maybe to quiet down our ego so we can actually be free to do what's best. And sometimes that's work harder, sometimes it's work smarter, and sometimes that's rest. And I think a lot of the running coaches I know would say that, for some of their very driven athletes, their actual job is to help them do less, not more, and work smarter, not harder. And so, kind of based on that discussion, he has a couple of points, talking about embracing vulnerability, something we've spoken about before, keeping things in perspective. And again, on this subject of motivation, actually aligning our motivations with our definition of success, and giving ourselves permission to fail, which again is probably another whole conversation. That'd be a good one for a podcast. But what I actually wanted to explore with you is, I think the fifth point he has here is that a secure but flexible sense of self, and talks about this balance of identity, not endeavours. And I think we've spoken about the misnomer of balance, certainly with endeavours, several times on this podcast. And, that, particularly when you're pushing, this idea of embrace the suck, that there is no balance. But I like this idea of balance of identity, because I hadn't really thought about that. And it just to pick up on something I'd said earlier about this idea of, our identity and how much our clinical profession can play into that. And I don't think it's something that we maybe necessarily explore enough. So I'd love to hear your perspective with your coaching hat on this concept of balance of identity.
One of the podcasts that I think you've referred to before that I really like is the conversation about Ash Barty's mindset coach, and how he talks about the importance of human being, not human doing, and how he encourages Ash. And, from this, I've taken the importance of knowing yourself. What is it that you do that makes you you, that makes you worthwhile, that makes you enough, that you can be completely comfortable with and appreciative of, without needing to do the next big thing, without needing to win the next race, without needing to get the next position. Not to say that there's anything wrong with doing another race or getting that position. And if it goes well and it makes you whole, then that's all good. But if you don't get it, where's your fallback place where you go, that's okay because I'm enough? And it's really interesting because I know Brené Brown has a new book about this as well. And don't we all love Brené Brown?
I've just downloaded it.
Yeah, and talks about very much the same thing, it is the courage to be vulnerable and to not just expose yourself for the sake of exposing yourself, but to actually know that it's okay, because underneath all that is this foundation of self-belief and self-acceptance that what you're doing is really enough. And it again, to use another very common saying at the moment, it fills your cup, and you've got what you need without having to do that extra bit. And there's nothing wrong with doing the extra bits. It's just, that might be who you are, to want to strive, to want to achieve, to want to push. And that's who you are, and that's good. But that doesn't mean that you have to have a success in every endeavour.
Yeah. And because I've gone there, and I appreciate this could be a whole podcast, on the subject of failure, because I feel the more I fail, the better I get at it. I'd love some coaching perspective on embracing failure.
Do you know, one of the things that I know Brené says in her most recent book is that when you hear stories of failure, you normally hear the story that goes, this terrible thing happened to me, and everyone goes, oh my God, and it was so awful, and I was so broken. But then the clouds parted and the sun came out, and I'm fine, and I'm a stronger person, and I've learned from it. So even though we tell these stories of vulnerability, we tell it from but I defeated it, I downed Goliath. What we don't talk about is when we're in the hole.
Yeah.
And that is super hard to say, actually, I'm in this pretty tricky place and I don't really know how I'm going to get out of it. And I'm hoping that I'll get out of it. And one day I will tell a story about how I got out of it. But right now, I just want you to know that I'm not okay.
Yeah. I think those are very difficult conversations to admit. And, to put a trite example of that, we don't share the wordle that we stuffed up.
Well, that's so true. I mean, it's about humans, and the way we interact with each other is we always show our best selves. Everybody has a picture perfect life because they only take pictures of their perfect life. They don't take pictures of all the bits they don't want to show, the warts and all approach.
So how do we get better at this? I think we openly acknowledge the need to have honest conversations around failure and vulnerability, and accept and normalize this. But I think we still find it very hard. I know that, part of that is leading by example and role modeling this yourself. But, I still think I still think we struggle.
I was just thinking, I'm feeling a bit uncomfortable as you're saying this because I know the answer is role modeling and leadership. And I know that I've come into this podcast saying, oh, I've learned so much about leadership and I love it and I love coaching and it's so important, and it is. It's all very, very genuine. And if I'm going to role model this vulnerability, then I need to express it myself. And I think the way to do it is actually to role model it. And I was talking to a friend recently who's a surgeon about how do we teach our trainees, if you just want to keep it clinical for the moment, that it's okay to feel scared. Like, I was actually talking to my friend last night because yesterday I was in ED and there was a patient who had a upper airway bleed and it was really scary. And I was standing at the end of the bed thinking, that physical anxiety, like, I know this is going to get better. I know it's going to go away. I'm in a good place. There's people who help me. We're doing the right things. Things are getting better. But I still can't help the fact that I feel anxious right now. But I didn't go and say anything to the team about I'm feeling anxious. I did joke with the ENT reg, oh, these kind of patients make me tremble. But I didn't actually say I have physical anxiety right now, knowing that I'm responsible for the outcome of this patient. And my friend who's a surgeon was saying that they'd been in a very difficult surgical procedure where, the room went quiet because it was really, really tricky and they had to manage some complications. And no one talked about it. At the end of it was like, close up, thanks very much, see you later, kids. It was all done. No one said that. And at what level is it okay to be vulnerable? You can't say in the resus room, you can't put your hand up and say, I just want everyone to know I'm not feeling very comfortable right now. Because you need that style of leadership where you're providing direction and certainty, and you need people to feel comfortable with you. In the same way that in the middle of a crisis in an operating room, people need to be able to have, leadership in that sense of everything's going to be okay, I'm in control, chill out, it'll be all right. But somehow we have to talk to our trainees about the fact that when you feel like this, that is actually how we feel. We're not standing there. We talk about the swan and the feet going underneath, and that's a lovely metaphor. I used it myself and I really like it. But I think maybe we should be talking to our trainees more about what the feet are doing under the water than rather how you remain graceful on the top.
Yeah, brilliant analogy and very well put. I'm sitting here thinking, who would I contact when I left that room? And it would be my critical friend, one of my mentors, or my coach.
And I think we have to tell our trainees that as well. I mean, when you have a really stressful experience, and particularly if someone dies and it's emotionally challenging, we all walk out now and say, that was really hard. It's really good that you feel upset. If you didn't feel upset, there were problems. And I think that's a change, honestly, from when I first started working in medicine. We didn't say that to each other. So at least we're now acknowledging it's okay to be upset when someone dies. But that's a pretty low mark, right? Yeah. If all we can agree on is that it's okay to be upset when someone dies, we're really not being vulnerable. I think what we need to walk away and say is it's okay to feel really stressed in that environment. And even when you're in charge, you're going to feel stressed in that environment. But you are surrounded by a team and this is what you've trained for, and you will be okay and you will be confident in the moment. But it's okay to walk away and tell people that you didn't feel okay.
I could talk to you all day, Sarah. I think we could pick any number of topics relevant to this conversation and spend 40 minutes exploring them. But I want to segue back round because I think going back to that ABC, like belonging, meaning, contribution, I actually think these things certainly come a bit easier in our job. I think we're fortunate that way. The autonomy, I think it's a big thing. And I think particularly as, I think autonomy disappears through training program often, and you feel like you're on that treadmill. I certainly had a big battles with autonomy at that stage, and I was trying to reclaim it post fellowship. But I'm also conscious that when you look at the Stanford wellbeing wheel, which I quite like, part of that is the culture of our practice. There are certainly those individual tools that you're culturing through coaching, but a big part of that is the efficiency of our practice. And, a lot of what you got in that framework is, our ability to actually, we are powerless in many of the frustrating, slow, overburdened, overwhelmed systems that we're working in. And the care as imagined is not what actually happens in practice. And I think that is the main challenges that we face at the moment. And that's a real source of our distress. But that, the flip side is that you're not only working on the individual, working on the culture, but you're actually now in a place where you are having conversations to actually make meaningful change, to actually offload clinician burden. I mean, we know like the EMR and, just all the clunkiness in our systems. So I'd love, because you now work in a space where you're actually able to make that change. So what does that look like in terms of eHealth and health innovation for you today, in terms of potential to offload that clinical burden, get doctors back to doctoring, and what is your vision? What would you like to see happen in the next few years in that space?
I think what you've called out, Cheryl, is exactly why clinicians need to be, in my view, in these systems improvement roles, and not just doing it, 4 days a week like I do. You don't have to do that, but show up for the committee, show up for the representation, get onto some kind of leadership position yourself, because if that voice isn't there, no one can hear it. So what I don't want is for clinicians to feel like the system's been built in a way that doesn't help us, but not actually have tried to change it or not have been given the opportunity to change it. So I think that our health systems are now much more receptive to clinical voices, because we know that when we build things with clinicians, it's going to be a better outcome. And you could say exactly the same thing about patients, which is a whole other story, but it's equally as important. And I think that in trying to optimize the system, there's a whole lot of work around chaos theory, right? And we know that our health system is very chaotic and unpredictable. And the thing that they know works best in complex, the thing that we know works best in the VUCA environment is talking to people at the front line who do it all day, every day. They are the people who have the solutions. They may not have the time or the power to turn it into a project that runs statewide, but they know what the solution is because they live and breathe it every day. So these are the clinical voices we need to be capturing in this system change, because there's no point trying to improve the culture or trying to work on your own well-being if the structures and processes are always going to work against you. So we have to have clinical voices changing those structures and processes. So that means that we have to actually have days where you sit in a system and contribute to what the design of something is. And from a digital health perspective, that means that we need clinicians to be involved in processes like we've just been involved with in New South Wales, where clinicians have listened to vendors present the way that the next EMR could work and show them this is what an EMR can bring. And there's a lot of different inputs into that decision. Don't get me wrong. It's not only clinical. This is a partnership. But at least clinicians are now being asked to provide input with, I really like the way that system made it really easy to send educational information through to patients. Or I didn't think it was particularly helpful that the way that the laboratory information was displayed was on a separate screen. I mean, they're just made up examples, but we have a clinical voice in that decision making. So my job in New South Wales Health right now is to provide a space for clinicians to come to provide the input into the design and decisions that are made for the next electronic medical record, but more than that, even the digital health platform that will form the foundations of healthcare in New South Wales. And that means that we can get to a system that will make our jobs better. And 5 years, 10 years from now, I hope that we will have systems, particularly talking about digital health systems, that release doctors to do what they do best. to help them work at the top of their game. So they don't have to spend time trying to work out how to do the e-meds order, or they don't have to look at 15 different online forms in order to get an orthopaedic clinic booked. It will just happen in the background. And better than that, you'll automatically be offering best practice to your patients because there'll be a streamlined pop-up box that will pretty much pre-fill out what needs to happen. And better than that, there'll be interactive virtual platforms where patients will have all this information and other care teams will have all this information. But we can't design a system like that unless there are clinical voices and patient voices that are there saying, this is what I need to release me from doing the admin tasks so that I can actually do what I do best, which is making a diagnosis, offering treatment, and having human conversations with people.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think anyone listening here is not inspired and doesn't agree with you. That this is the vision of the future that we need, and we actually need it now. But based on the conversation we've just had about how long it actually takes to translate evidence into practice, I'd love to know how you see us harnessing some of this momentum we've seen through the pandemic. To make this vision a reality, not in 2 decades, but in a much shorter time frame.
It's a burning platform, isn't it? And the problem is, as opposed to burning out, or maybe that's why, you can't keep fueling the burning platform or people will burn out. So the things that we've done and we've done well, I think we have to work out what has been effective, not only in the improvements that we've made, but the way that we've made them and the inputs that have been required from clinicians to make that happen, and keep the best of it. And I say that because some of the things that have happened at pace have been because people have worked at pace, and there has been 24/7 turnarounds of things because people have been pulled in multiple directions and made very quick decisions, and they've potentially done things much more quickly with many more hours than they would normally be able to sustain. But there are ways of working that we have also developed that could potentially capture that and help that move forward. From a digital health perspective, previously a change request in terms of I want my EMR to look different, depending on where you are and what your local environment is, sometimes can take weeks or months for it to happen. But with COVID, we've made some of those changes happen, maybe not overnight, but certainly in a week. And we've never seen that kind of change before. But the way it's happened is that people have stepped up, walked away from their other commitments, turned up to regular meetings, made a commitment to make it happen. It's a little bit like the resus equivalent. And we all know that you couldn't be in resus all day, every shift, every day. So it's getting balanced like everything else.
And, I'd love to know, for people listening who are suitably inspired, and want to lead and be the change that they want to see as clinicians, and because there's been a bit of discussion around this lately, do they need to go and do a postgraduate qualification in MBA? Do they need to become a member graduate of the AICD to be that clinician voice in the C-suite? What would you advise them on where to start?
I would say start big and start small at the same time. So start big in terms of think about what do you want out of this and where are you going, and maybe if you have an opportunity to have a coach, or if you already have a mentor or someone you can do a bit of self-reflection with, you can even, if you don't, you can write yourself a letter. Write yourself a letter 5 years from now, and what would you write in that letter? What would you say to yourself? Don't worry so much about making a plan, it will happen anyway. Or you're really good at this, make sure you follow your path. Like, you can give yourself advice. That letter is a really good technique to do that if you don't have anyone you can talk to easily. So that's start big, work out where you're trying to go, but then start small. I really love the concept of the minimal viable action. What's one thing I can do today that's going to get me a little bit closer to that next step? I don't know if I want to do an MBA. I don't even know if I want to be a head of department, but I do know that I have a mentor I can think of who would probably help me out if I wanted to have a cup of coffee. So my minimal viable action today is that I'm going to have a coffee with that person. Yeah.
Brilliant advice. And I really feel that you talked about flow earlier. It feels like I'm talking and having an interaction with someone who is in full flow when you're talking about your work. Yeah, and I personally think it's a real joy to bear witness to that. I'd love to know how would you describe your work, your creative career today?
I think I would start by saying that I'm a platypus. I'm a little bit of lots of different things that don't normally fit together, but for me, they actually do fit together. And other people might look at part of it and go, oh, yeah, I get that part. I'm like that. But when they look at it all together, they kind of go, what? What is that thing? And it's taken me a really long time to get to a place where I go, well, it's my thing. And I think for all of us, it's about working out which features you want to put on your animal, which bits you want to join up, and then recognizing that even if it's not traditional, it's still going to be okay and you're comfortable with it. And I think that's the beauty of reflection and having time to develop some insight and potentially some experience and maybe one day some wisdom, is that you can look back retrospectively and understand why it fits together and why it makes sense. And it's okay to have lots of different interests and lots of different ways of approaching things that are different to other people, as long as it's okay for you. And then once you are that thing, you are a unique thing, and nobody else can offer what you offer because nobody else has that setup. So I'm quite proud of being a platypus.
Love it. The platypus is one of my favourite animals.
Me too.
And the other's the seahorse.
Oh, true, but similar concept, right?
Exactly. Thank you. I mean, I really love that idea of the platypus as a pictorial representation of your creative career in medicine. And, you said before we got cut off at the very beginning that you wanted to start with why. And I mean, I think certainly to me and people listening, your why and your passion as a clinician and leader are very evident through this conversation. So I want you to thank you. I think as we move on to the closing questions, I think the one kind of burning question, if you like, that I still have is, what this actually looks like in terms of sustainable practice for you, because you are wearing a number of hats as both clinician and working in eHealth in the digital and executive leadership space and doing your coaching. And again, I'm thinking about Steve Magnus, who I mentioned earlier, who has another book that's apparently the lesser known book in the series called The Passion Paradox. He says that nobody really wants to read about a paradox. And it speaks a bit to kind of good and bad motivation, but also to the idea that if you do the thing you love, that you have this risk of working all the time. And, so I'm curious to know, how you set boundaries and make this sustainable for you, and what work-life integration looks like for you at the moment.
We talked before about my coaching experience, and I have had a couple of things that I bring up with my coaches every single time I go to coaching. And one of them that comes every single time is balance. And like all of us, I have spent a long time thinking about it. I think I am much better than I used to be, but I still have a way to go. And the things that work for me are black and white boundaries. So things like all the digital stuff in one room and close the door at a certain time. That's super important to me. It's saying things like, I am absolutely not going to open my email. I'm going to put my out of office on and I am not going to open it until I say I'm back in the office. And all these things are kind of easy to do and hard to adhere to, but you've got to hold yourself accountable to that. It's creating space where you really commit to not doing, as well as creating space where you commit to doing. And being clear that other people around you know that and respect that, and you reinforce that. So if I put on my out of office, I do not reply to emails, because I think if you put on your out of office and then you reply, people learn pretty quickly, she'll probably read it, she'll probably reply. So there's no easy answer. I think more than anything, it's just about being aware of it, having strategies about it, involving people around you in it to help hold you accountable, and being kind to yourself that it's not going to be perfect all the time, but that you'll keep learning and getting better.
You've mentioned a couple of books, links, references, some research that I will definitely put links to in the show notes. But is there anything else that you recommend to listeners based on our conversation that they might want to read, watch, listen to?
You may have mentioned it in other podcasts, but the Ash Barty Mindset Coach podcast, I think, is really worth listening to. I think that it really talks to you about what's important and being able to focus on what's important. And it's really good for performance planning as well when you're thinking about going into a high pressure environment. But I really like that podcast. I've listened to it many times and I think there's something new to take every time.
Yeah, I mean, excellent recommendation. I agree. I do like listening to Mojo Crow. And in my episode with Hugh Van Keilenberg, he referred to Ben Crow. And yeah, this he certainly references a bit of his work there. So that's a good one. And what does Sarah do next?
I've one of the things that's helped me remain sustainable is to use all my leave. And I have used my long service leave, and every 3 years or so, I've had about 3 months off. So what I do next is I turn 50 and I have 3 months off work. That's my grand plan. I'm not sure if that will turn out. And then what I do next is actively plan to not work full time. And I don't know which bit I'm going to give up. And one of my biggest challenges at the moment is working through, I was about to say how I can still have it all, and then I'm correcting myself into knowing I can't. How I choose which bit I will focus on for a while. And then beyond that, I still don't know, because it's been a happenstance journey and it will probably continue to be. And I just feel incredibly lucky that I really love everything that I do. And that does create a challenge, but how lucky am I if my biggest challenge is that I love everything I do?
I mean, I know that you have talked about serendipity and happenstance, but, you know, I have the Gary Player quote in my head when you say that. Sarah, I think the joy that you have for your work, and it is important work, is very apparent. I find it very inspiring, and I suspect likewise for people listening. And just on what you've said about the sabbatical there, you know, we talk about the Self-Care Sunday on the podcast. This might be the 50th sabbatical. You know, what would that look like for you if you were to design it?
It's always a combination of the holy trinity of something with high activity, something with low activity, and food. And it could be a combination of either of those things. And it would depend whether we're just talking about a regular Sunday, which I'm trying to quarantine as part of a sustainable thing, or whether it's a big bang 50th excitement. But generally on a weekend, that will mean some form of exercise, either a walk or a run with friends, some kind of exciting food adventure. We actually often plan our runs around new coffee shops. So we meet at a coffee shop that we really want to go for a run, and then make up for the calories. I also love to have what we call urban adventures, which is to choose somewhere in Sydney where we haven't been for a while and find a new restaurant and go and have lunch. Anything really. I like to change it up. I wouldn't be emergency doctor if I didn't like change. So I like to do different stuff, but I have to balance it with downtime. And that's the unplug, turn everything off, get in the bath, read a book, just do nothing, embrace silence, something to kind of bring it down a bit as well. So it's got to be all three.
Yeah, that sounds like the trifecta for me. And hopefully I'll persuade you to come here and run with me on the mountain, because we actually have a coffee shop halfway up. So one of my favourite things to do is go for a run on the mountain, either stop off for a coffee midway through or at the end. So I'm going to hold you to that one.
Perfect. Oh, I'm there.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Just before we finish, and I will put the links in the show notes, I'd love you to tell listeners where we can find you. And, you know, if there's somebody who's listening who might have a specific question about coaching, you know, how they could contact you.
Our website is at Capstan Partners, which I imagine you can put in the show notes, but you can also Google Capstan Partners Coaching. And that is a healthcare coaching organisation. I'm also on LinkedIn, really happy to take LinkedIn messages. And I'm genuinely really happy to talk to people about what coaching is, what mentoring is, and help people work out what they might want to do next. Just as a short conversation, no obligation, doesn't mean that anything needs to happen after that. But it is hard for people to understand sometimes what coaching is and how it could work. And I'm really happy to help people navigate that. I love the question, what is leadership? Because I really think there's so many ways of answering it. At its fundamental basis, I think leadership is about change. So leadership is about making things happen. And that could be anything from, you know, working with patients and offering them treatment plans and encouraging them to follow them, through to having a team with you in a clinical environment where you're offering care to patients, either inpatients or outpatients, right through to changing things at a department level, at a hospital or system level, and then, obviously beyond that as well. There's so many sayings about leadership, and I really just don't know where to start, but I recently heard a quote which is different to what we normally hear, which I really like, which is that leadership is about disappointing people at just the rate to which they can absorb. But I love the quote because it kind of is saying you're not going to get change unless you cause a little bit of discomfort. But if you cause too much discomfort, you will lose people. So you've got to take them along with you, but you've also got to get them to change. So ultimately, for me, leadership is about helping people move to a different place and overcoming a bit of discomfort, because there will be some discomfort.
The MBA New South Wales ACT does wonderful work for those of our colleagues who are, at this very minute, experiencing a hard time. One way you can show you care about doctors' welfare is to go to their website, www.mbansw.org.au, and donate today. Knowing that their colleagues' care is a big part of these doctors' recovery, so please be part of the solution. All donations are tax deductible. If you can, please consider a monthly donation, as even small amounts collectively will allow them to plan their growth to support the increased demand.